All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome back, everyone. This is the afternoon of September 26th and I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Board. We are in the afternoon of Phase 3 of the hearing in the court reference proceeding in the case of City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar, Monterey County Superior Court, case number 20CV001387. And it is the afternoon of September 26th. I don't know if I got that in there. Where we left off was Mr. Moore on cross-examination of Ms. Nelson. We had one outstanding procedural item, which was to set a date for CalAm. I believe the conversation I was having was with Mr. Betts specifically about a written motion with respect to Dr. Kincaid's testimony and related exhibits. And I think we wanted to talk about a deadline for CalAm to submit that motion in writing so that ideally we can maintain, well, we can talk about it, but maintain that October 4th deadline for MCWD to respond that went along with CalAm's other objections. So Mr. Betts, I turn to you. Did you have a chance to confer with your team about a reasonable date to get that motion in writing?
I did. I was hoping to have till next Tuesday to do the motion, and I was going to propose, and of course this is, you'll need time to review it, that they would have until the 9th or 10th to respond, which gives you not a huge amount of time, but till the 12th for when we have our follow-up hearing. That's my wish list. Yeah.
I will turn then. Thank you. It's good to have. I appreciate you phrasing it that way. But what I'll do is I'll turn to City of Marina and MCWD. I guess City of Marina, you already have CalAm's motion with respect to Mr. Tietz's testimony, so it would help me out if we can maintain the October 4th deadline. Does that, I'm not sure who I'm looking to here. Does that make sense to you in terms of a deadline for responding to CalAm's motion with respect to Mr. Tietze?
Yes, good afternoon, and
Hi.
Thank you. We are still fine with October 4th.
Okay, and that was helpful because then I will have a chance to look at that sooner. That helps me somewhat. And then I will turn to MCWD. Would an October 10th response to CalAm's motion, if they were to submit it on the 3rd, work for you?
Without having talked to my team, I think October 10th could possibly work. But I'm not sure why CalAm needs a week. I do believe that the AHO's previous order instructed them to submit in writing their objections to both Marina and MCWD's exhibit. So if they had these objections, that would have been the time to do so, not next week.
Well, just briefly, a lot of it emanates from the testimony that we got today.
If Mr. Betts could give us specifics as to what was testified to today that was not available in writing.
Well, I'll respond.
He said that he didn't get a lot of his questions answered, so I don't know how the non-answers could be relevant to this.
Well, let's put this aside because I think, I mean, I understand the back and forth, and then I think I did, at least orally, if not in writing, say that there may be, CalAm may have additional motions based on cross-examination. I understand there's we could probably get into this pretty deeply about whether or not the testimony could have been either anticipated or was already in writing. I'm going to go ahead and submit, and let's go ahead and establish this. We'll keep the October 4th deadline for responses to CalAm's initial motion with respect to Mr. Tietz's testimony. I will set a deadline for CalAm to get in their motion with respect to Dr. Kincaid's testimony and any other, and if there are any objections to Ms. Nelson's testimony, that would also be the same day of October 3rd. And then the other parties would have until October 10th to respond. And I'm not looking for long motions, but I know with it is helpful to have the citations in writing, and that's really what is important to me, so that we're not doing it on the fly orally. It will save us some time before October 12th. On that, is there anything else we should address at this time?
Ms. Kunze, either now
Yes.
or at the end, either way, we can clarify the status of both exhibits and what they are, 98 and 131. And the portions looked at this morning and what the PUC has acted on and all that. So I could do it whenever it's convenient for you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Osias. I think what we'll try to do is power through. I want to make sure we get through the witnesses, as I'm sure you agree with, and then we will turn to other things as we have time. Thank you, Mr. Osias. With that, I will turn to you, Mr. Moore and Ms. Nelson. And if you would, Mr. Moore, I invite you to continue your cross-examination of Ms. Nelson.
Thank you, and I hope I've handled the voice issue. So
So far, it seems improved. So
okay, good. Ms. Nelson, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to have some questions for you that are so simple and so easy for you to answer that you won't believe it. Let me start with one, and that is, you've talked about the 29,800 salinity and the ocean. So is 29,800 possibly the ocean salinity?
You mean like
That's
in
not
the
fair.
ocean or objection vague? If he's referring to just seawater sitting in the ocean, that's one thing. If referring to water that's in the groundwater aquifers, that's an entirely different thing. And then if he's referring to groundwater in the aquifers, he would need to specify what aquifer and where.
that seems fair. Mr. Moore, if you would please clarify your question.
I will do that. Would you agree that the most important factor to understand and consider ocean water percentage is TDS?
I guess I'm not sure on what you mean. If what you're saying is that ocean water percentage is calculated based on total dissolved solids that are measured in the slant well, as it's, from the extraction from the slant well, yes, total dissolved solids is the basis for estimation of TDS as it comes out of the slant well and it is measured.
Did you attempt to create an artificially low ocean water percentage, lower percentage, based on changing the TDS value, meaning it went from 33,800 to 33,500 to 29,800 milligrams per liter?
Again, I did not change the ocean water total dissolved solids.
Mr. Moore, I was more directly involved in the fate and transport assignment of the TDS values, so it might be better for me, but I'd just throw that out. So I defer to you guys.
Okay, well, go ahead. That's Stan.
Is that for me?
I think
Yes.
that's for you,
Okay,
Dr.
then yes, it fit with our conceptual model of which I think we've now talked about, that there is seaward flow in the dune sand aquifer, which means that conceptually we believe that the water in the dune sand aquifer, submarine portion of the dune sand aquifer, is some mixture of ocean water infiltrating downward from the ocean and fresh water recharging from the east and discharging or blending together, so that the TDS value assigned as the in that layer, in the DSA layer, should be lower than ocean water. And the exact value, of course, we don't know and hasn't been measured, but it actually was part of our quote unquote calibration attempt to try to look at the TDS and correlate to the TDS in the test slant well, which we now know is problematic.
So how did you decide to assign a number of 29,800.
So,
This water.
well, again, I'm speaking very generally, but essentially we're trying to create, we're trying to simulate a lower TDS value in the slant well than ocean water, because that's what was reported. And if the higher the TDS value in the ocean we used, the higher that TDS value in the test slant well would go. And then ultimately we determined that the value assigned in the dredge pond or in the CMEX operation was as important or more important than what was going on in the ocean. So the values assigned were assigned in such a way as to try to match the results in the test slant well.
And by whom were these assigned, the numbers assigned? You, your team, or somebody else?
Well, it would have been my team, which consisted of Dr. Trudell and his associate, and then the members of the EKI staff for the transport modeling.
So tell me, what when you look at these numbers, and you say it was created by your staff or you and your staff, whatever it was, what went into consideration when you came up with the number of 29,800 or 33,500? I mean, what's the difference and how do you get the difference? I'm sorry.
Well, as I said, the objective was to try to match the TDS in the test slant well. So that was the objective. And the model's ability to simulate the TDS in the test slant well turned out to be highly dependent on the TDS assigned to the submarine portion of the dune sand aquifer and the TDS assigned to the CMEX operation. And again, as it turned out, I think we determined that it's more sensitive to, sufficiently sensitive to the CMEX operation to render, in my opinion, the whole thing just massively uncertain. We really don't know what the TDS, we don't have a direct measure of what is the TDS in the submarine portion of the dune sand aquifer. And we don't know what the TDS, we don't really know what the TDS is and the quantity of water going into the CMEX operation. And we obviously don't know exactly how much freshwater recharge is coming in from the dune sand aquifer. So ultimately we have three unknowns and not enough equations to really provide certainty on that. But the TDS values assigned were assigned as part of our effort to achieve calibration to the TDS measured at the test slant well.
Well, a lower number also means more fresh water for the dune sand aquifer, correct?
Not necessarily, because the TDS in the test slant well, we know in the ideal world, I believe, as I interpret the whole point of the test slant well operation, was to establish the ability to use a 2N member mixing model, an assumption about what the TDS is on the inland source, the freshwater source, if you will, and then the TDS, of course, for the ocean water. And then the fact that the value that you measure at the test slant well must be some mixture of those two components. And if you can get the volumes or kind of estimate the volumes, you could get like how much comes from each source, thus the OWP. So that was the whole point of the exercise. But once the CMEX operation gets thrown into the mix, we now have three sources of unknowns that are contributing to the ultimate value at the test slant well. And none of those three have really been really solidly measured. So as a consequence of that, it's a massive amount of unknown. We just really don't know. The utility of the test slant well falls away as a mechanism to provide an independent calibration check for the model. But if we were to have assigned ocean water, the TDS equivalent to ocean water to the dune sand aquifer, then the model simulation would have been pure ocean water at the test slant well. So that would not have achieved the calibration to the observed value. So That we know couldn't be the case, at least with the flow models as it is at present. So that's why we ended up with the TDS where it ended up.
Okay, you mentioned that there's a lot of unknown. How do you come up with a number when there's a lot of unknown going into it? Is there a formula, some way you get around this problem?
Yeah, it would be X plus Y plus Z equals TDS in the test slant well. And it would be X times the percentage of X plus Y times the percentage of Y plus Z times the percentage of Z equals the only known you have, which is the volume and the TDS of the water coming out of the test slant well. We know the TDS of the ocean. We don't know the percentage from the ocean. That's the whole point. We reasonably know the TDS of the freshwater, but we don't know how much freshwater. And if it was just those two, we could have worked out an estimate for the relationship. Well, once you add the CMEX into the situation, now you have an unknown percentage and an unknown TDS. So that's why there are too many unknowns. So for the problem, if you need to have an equation for every unknown, and now we have more unknowns than we have equations.
Will these numbers be changed anytime soon? I mean, are you going to have?
I don't understand.
Are you going to have the kind of information you need to make a more precise estimate of the number? Is that going to be something you're going to have access to? Or are you going to be able to do in the future?
Personally, I don't see how we're going to resolve that problem and provide a better answer for the OWP, a measure of OWP to calibrate against, unless you perform a new pumping test, a new pump test.
Okay. I take it you're not close to that at this point.
That's not. I guess I don't understand the question. I wasn't contracted to perform a pumping test or to even develop or propose one. So
that'll be somebody else to come up with some kind of improved test. It's not you specifically.
Yeah, it would be up to, at this point, it would be up to, if you wanted to reduce the uncertainty in the models, to be clear, we have certain levels of uncertainty. And as in every modeling exercise, what it boils down to is whether you can live with the uncertainty that exists. So if the parties can live with the uncertainty that exists, then there's no need for additional information. If the uncertainty is unacceptable, then more information is needed to reduce that uncertainty.
Dr. Kincaid, thank you. I'll go back to
Yes, sir.
Ms. Nelson. Hi again.
Hello.
Let me ask you something. It's my information, the best way to put it, that MCWD's flow model was calibrated using 2019 to 2021 conditions. True?
There was a calibration period. The calibration period that was agreed to by the experts was water year 2019 through 2021.
Okay. So what I just said was true. A flow model was calibrated using 2019 to 2021 conditions. That's a yes, right?
I think you need to put water year in front of that.
A water year and a calendar year aren't the same, Bob.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it, Kyle. Well, what I'm talking about right now is the flow model. And I'm talking about the flow model was calibrated using those two dates, the 2019, 2021 conditions. True or not true?
Yes, the flow model was calibrated to water year 2019 through water year 2021.
Okay, great. So again, I'll go back as an answer. Thank you. And then you use the flow model 2921 conditions to run a solute transport model calibrated from October 2015 to February 2018. Is that correct?
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry. Can you please repeat it?
You used the flow model 2019 conditions to run the solute transport model calibration from October 2015 to February 2018. Pretty straightforward, right?
No, I don't. We didn't. So maybe I can help out. The caliber. What we did is.
Please, I really want you to answer the question before you help.
I can't answer the question. I don't understand the question. I mean, there wasn't calibration. So the flow model was calibrated to the period that you just asked. And
Yes.
then we ran scenarios forward based on that calibration. So there were scenario B, C, and D that were run forward. They were not calibrations.
Well, isn't this a effort to calibrate the transport model to data from a different time frame than the data used to calibrate its flow model, right?
So again, the transport model sits on top of the flow model.
I understand.
So in other words, what you do is you take the calibrated version of the transport model, and then you simulate scenarios, the scenarios that we were requested to simulate. And we simulated both the water level, basically the heads, as well as transport associated with those scenarios. And if what you're asking are what are the initial conditions that were utilized as part of the transport model, those were identified based on current TDS measurements that were obtained during the calibration period, generally between 2019 and water year 2021, with some additional data incorporated to assess what the concept, if we didn't have data during that period. So we utilized other data to help inform that. So those were the initial TDS concentrations that were put into the transport model.
Again, Mr. Moore, I might be able to help clarify since I was more to point. I believe the date period that you're talking about is the test slant well period. So both parties agreed to try to calibrate the model to the test slant well results, which was operated earlier than the 2019 to 2021 period for which the rest of the flow modeling and everything else was calibrated. But that's a function of the fact that the test slant well was operated during that. That's when the test slant well test was performed. So I think that's what you're referring to. But aside from that, as Ms. Nelson stated, the model was calibrated to 2019 to 2021 conditions.
Well, my opinion is, or my thought is, it looks like you're calibrating your solo transport model to data from a different time period than the data used to calibrate your flow model.
No, we calibrated to what we agreed to calibrate with the AHO, which is the test slant well. And yes, the test slant well was conducted prior to the calibration period, but that doesn't mean that we calibrated the model to different time periods. It means that we had a singular estimate conducted by a singular test of what the OWP was thought to be at the test slant well. And we attempted to reproduce that in the model, thus, quote unquote, calibrate to that condition. Now, subsequent to that, there's been much discussion and revelation about the quality of the data from which the test slant well estimate of OWP was derived. And so that whole effort is, from my perspective now, significantly called into question. But nonetheless, that's what we agreed to do, was to calibrate to 2019 to 2021 conditions. And then subsequently, with respect to the flow model, the only thing that we really had to try to calibrate to see if the transport model reasonably reproduced something, something that was actually measured, was the test slant well. And so that's what we tried to reproduce.
Let me ask you. So these are two different time frames. One's 2019 to 2021. The other is October 2015 to February 2018. And you're telling me now it doesn't make any difference.
No, I'm telling
Do a
you that we
calibration.
decided as a group to
Hold on,
calibrate the
just
flow
a second.
model.
Just one second.
Hold
Let me
on,
clarify.
Let
Sorry.
him finish his question.
Before you get started, I'm just saying, what group are you talking about now?
I'm talking about the team, the both sides experts. So the experts meetings or whatever, that however we described it.
And when did those meetings end?
I don't know off the top of my head. The last meeting was somewhere proximal to the hearing, or I don't think it was formally called a hearing, but the AHO meeting that we had prior to the May 31 submission deadline. So it was at least a couple weeks prior to that, but I don't know the actual date of that last meeting.
I've got another real simple question, I think, and one that's not going to be terribly controversial, but are the hydrology and groundwater levels identical for these two time periods?
No.
Thank you, Dr. Kincaid, again for your help. I appreciate it. Again, back to simple questions. You used a steady state model for your solute transport model, right?
Well, the solute transport model, the flow model is a steady state model, but the transport model actually simulates transport through time. So it's not technically a steady state model. It estimates, how transport under the steady state conditions developed in the flow model, how the chemicals, or I should say the salt, would move over a period of time.
Did you ever consider using a transient model?
I think the steady state flow model that was developed, it was agreed upon by the experts to go to a steady state model pretty early in the process, the flow model.
Well, I mean, CalAm experts didn't do that, did they?
Yes, they did. Both the WBSSM CalAm and WBSSM, MCWD models are steady state models. And that was what was agreed to by the experts and approved by the AHO.
That's actually what the SSM means, by the way, is steady state model.
I think that's all I have for right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson, for your time today. I think we'll be hearing from you again, but thank you for your testimony today. I think with that, I realize we may need a break, but I will turn to Mr. Brochard. It looks like you're off mute, so I will turn to you. with respect to whether you have, and I'm sure I need a City of Marina representative, but whether you have a redirect for any of your witnesses,
I do.
and both? Which
Uh,
witness?
I think it would be both. I think Dr. Kincaid can probably handle most of it, but Ms. Nelson may be better for a couple questions.
Great, thank you. And then who should I look to with respect to City of Marina's witnesses? Mr.
I
Thank
can address that, yeah. I have a brief point of clarification for Dr. Trudell, and I believe Mr. Spalding will have a few questions for Mr. Tietze.
Great. Do either of you, it seems like it makes sense to take a 10-minute break so that everyone can organize themselves for, and what order you prefer to go in for redirect. I don't have a preference, so I think you can work that out amongst yourselves.
Well, one question, if we could get a time
Yes.
estimate, I understand Ms. Meisenheimer's comments about the city's witnesses, but again, we're hoping this doesn't just turn into further direct examination. Mr. Burchard can give us a time estimate.
Sure, let's do that. Mr. Burchard, do you have at this point, I realize you may have to go through your notes, but do you have a time estimate for redirect of your witnesses?
I think I would guess 30 minutes, and I think that's on the high end, but I'm not positive.
Okay, thank you. And
I'm
Ms.
sorry,
Meisenheimer?
I apologize. Is that cumulative for Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson?
Yes, I said I'm not even sure I have questions for Ms. Nelson.
And then Ms. Meisenheimer, do you have a estimate? I know you said you indicated short, but do you have an estimate?
My point of clarification for Dr. Trudell will be less than 5 minutes, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Spalding to address the questions for Mr. Tietze.
Thank you.
And I would estimate 5 to 7 minutes for Mr. Tietze.
Great. Mr. Betts, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you for allowing us to do that.
That's helpful. Let's go ahead and take, I know we just came off of lunch, but I want to give, I think it makes sense. You may have to organize your witnesses, but so let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 1:45. I will turn things over to the appropriate person to begin redirect. Thank you. Welcome back from our brief break. I'm looking to the room and just seeing we have all of the relevant faces here. All right, I will look to the attorneys. Which witness do we have? Which of you is up first, and which witness will we hear from first?
Ms. Kinsey, I'll be going first. We are going to handle the witnesses in the same order that they presented.
Wonderful. That sounds good. So I will hand things over. Let's see, so that means Mr. Tietze is first, right?
Dr. Trudell.
Dr. Trudell is first. Okay. When they originally presented, not in which they were cross-examined. This is where I'm following along. Thank you.
The days do start to blur together.
Right. Dr. Trudell, thank you for joining us again this afternoon. Do you recall, I just wanted to ask whether you recall from our proceeding about a week and a half ago, taking the oath with respect to your testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, I do.
All right. And Ms. Meisenheimer, please go ahead if you have questions for your witness on redirect.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, if we could put up Exhibit 67, Slide 7. And while that's being called up, Dr. Trudell just had one point where I believe he misspoke and wanted to clarify the record. So we'll get to that when the slide is up. Dr. Trudell, do you see the right-hand section of the slide that refers to the calibrated model with the CalAm revised recharge swapped in?
Yes, I do.
And if you look at the column entitled mean residual, do you see that?
Yes.
Looking at the upper dune sand row, do you see the 7.91 feet?
I do.
Now, I believe in your prior testimony, you had stated that that indicated a head that was 7.91 feet too high. Was that what you intended to say?
No, I misspoke. A positive residual means that the simulated heads are too low. And so the simulated heads in the dune sand aquifer were too low by 7.91 feet on average, the mean residual.
Thank you, Dr. Trudell. We appreciate the clarification. And with that, I have no further redirect.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Meisenheimer. Thank you, Dr. Trudell. I appreciate it. And to my team, if you would please unpin us, then I can see the room.
And I believe Mr. Spalding will be going next with Mr. Tietze.
Thank you.
Yes, correct.
And so thank you, Mr. Thank you, Ms. Meisenheimer. Welcome back, Mr. Tietze. I will just ask, do you recall, Mr. Tietze, taking the oath with respect to your testimony in this proceeding, which I administered approximately a week and a half ago when we met previously in phase 3?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Mr. Spalding, with your redirect for Mr. Tietze.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Tietze.
Good afternoon.
All right, I have two sets of questions for you. Number one, what did you mean during your cross-examination when you stated that you do not consider yourself a modeler?
That just means that at this stage in my career, I'm not tasked with building models as my full-time assignment. I utilize models, and I generally at this stage have others or other teams put together models for me, and I work closely with them, but I do build them myself on occasion.
All right, thank you. All right, topic number 2, I would like to ask Ms. Mullen to pull up Marina Exhibit 22. Now, Mr. Tietze, I will represent to you, contrary to what Mr. Osias represented to you in the tribunal, that this exhibit has been admitted into evidence. And my questions start with, have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have many times.
Can you briefly explain what it is?
It is the initial report of Ian Gottschalk, so Dr. Rosemary Knight and her team from Stanford regarding the aerial electromagnetics geophysical investigation of the nearshore Marina area of the 400 foot subbasin.
Did you rely on it in your testimony?
Yes, I did.
And do you believe it was an appropriate document for you to rely on? And why do you believe that?
We first started dealing with this particular report during the preparation of the groundwater sustainability plan for the Marina GSA, and found it to be a well-researched and well-substantiated investigation that was consistent with and integrated with lithological and water quality sampling in the area. And so similar to many situations where you try to compile the best available data, this was one key piece of information alongside other data that we used to develop the groundwater sustainability plan. And it's an important, it provides an important perspective on understanding of both hydrostratigraphy as well as water quality distribution in the nearshore area. So in short, my answer is yes. I believe it's a very important piece of work. It's appropriate to rely on it. In fact, it would be inappropriate not to.
And how exactly did you rely on it in the context of the variable density model testimony?
So I first maybe can provide a little bit broader answer, which is that when you're compiling information to form an opinion or form an understanding of variable density flow or the interaction between water quality, salinity, and hydrostratigraphy in an area, which is what variable density flow is in the nearshore area, you want to have at your disposal all of the available and the best available data. Geophysical investigations being conducted from the surface probe the subsurface indirectly and provide a more three-dimensional picture, typically. This type of geophysical investigation does. And coupled with data from borings and from wells, which provide single points of evidence of what's going on at that particular location. So we relied on it to tie together those two types of data to form an opinion as to what was the hydrostratigraphy that controls groundwater flow, whether it be variable density or uniform density flow or flow under hydraulic head. And also the water quality distribution as it goes to what would be considered fresh water or fresher water under State Water Resources Control Board resolutions, and more dense water, so more highly saline water, including seawater or heavily seawater intruded water that would be more dense than the fresh water and would interact with it in predictable ways and produce vertical flow or horizontal flow under density gradients as well as under hydraulic gradients. So it's a lot of words in that answer, but the upshot is that this particular type of data helps to tie together borings over a broader area to allow a more in-depth or more rooted perspective of those processes of variable density flow.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Spalding, and thank you, Mr. Titsa, for joining us again.
Thank you.
With that, Mr. Brochard, I will turn to you. In which order do you plan to redirect your witnesses?
Dr. Kincaid, please.
All right. And I will wait for all this to end up here, I think. All right, with that, I will go ahead. We've heard from Dr. Kincaid already today, so I will turn things over to you without further ado, Mr. Brochard.
Thank you. Can we pull up exhibit Marina Coast 164, MCWD 164? This is perfect. Dr. Kincaid, do you remember that Mr. Betts asked you some questions about this paragraph, specifically what uncertainty you had with Marina Coast model?
Yes.
Okay. What uncertainty, if any, do you have with CalAm's water board steady state model 2023?
Well,
Hold on. Briefly, I object. It's beyond the scope. I mean, I asked him, of course, he didn't answer, but the issues with the MCWD model, I had no questions about the CalAm model. And I think he's testified about that before.
Do you have a response to that, Mr. Brochard?
Well, I think he asked him about this sentence, and this sentence includes both. And I believe when Dr. Kincaid tried to give an answer to both, Mr. Betts said that I'm sure you can answer that question later.
Well, he is correct. I continually said I don't have questions about the CalAm model. The MCWD model is the only thing I had questions about. So to have him repair it or retestify about issues that he's already provided testimony about, I think really it does go beyond the scope.
On this one, I agree with you, Mr. Betts. I think I'm going to.
I can ask a different question if it's.
Let's ask a different question now, because Mr. Betts was very particular and careful about the way he phrased that question with respect to the sentence. So please, Mr. Brochard.
You testified as to your uncertainty with the Marina Coast model. Would those same uncertainties also apply to the CalAm model?
Same objection, beyond the scope. I had no questions on the CalAm model. I was solely focused on the uncertainties and the impossibilities with the MCWD model.
I think that's fair, Mr. Brochard. Mr. Betts didn't go there and very carefully didn't go there. So let's move on to the next.
That's fine. We can take this down then.
Thank you.
Dr. Kincaid, do you recall Mr. Betts asked you some questions about the Coastal Commission document and specifically Special Condition 12? There was discussion about a mitigation plan that would be developed.
Yes.
Okay. You said that you would have concerns if Marina Coast was not the executive director referenced in that condition. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Why would you be concerned with that?
Because I've seen stipulation or conditions like that in other projects, and on all the other projects that I've worked, all of the stakeholders hold seats at that table, at that metaphorical table, when it comes to developing the criteria by which a project that or an effort or things that might risk the water resource would be evaluated. So I think it's important that all of the stakeholders would have representation at that table, so to speak.
There was also a reference in that condition to the model validation.
Yes.
What do you understand that to mean?
Model validation is a very pretty specific term, and it means an effort. It describes the effort to compare model predictions against data specifically collected to determine if the predictions turned out to be correct. Thus, the word validate. So you're validating model predictions. So because it in that number 12, it talked about models that would be used to determine what risks and if something was going to occur that would impact the resource, And then validation, it implies very clearly that those models would be rigorously tested to be demonstrated that the predictions are reliable and validated. So that's what validation means.
Who determines whether a model is validated?
That's where the rubber meets the road, and that would be done by the quote unquote committee, I guess. As I don't think that particular document described it as a committee, but it would be determined by the group of experts, so to speak, that determine whether the model is validated or whether it's not validated, which is why all of the stakeholders for a given resource should have a seat at that table, the table that, of experts that determine what is and what isn't validated, what is and what isn't, what does and doesn't constitute impact.
Would you trust CalAm to be in charge of doing that modeling or determining whether it was validated?
No.
Why not?
No, for multiple reasons. First of all, you just don't trust the applicant to be solely in charge of the determination of the criteria by which the applicant's going to be judged. But kind of more specifically in this case, my experience with the models that have been produced for this case are such that every time we look at it, the models are designed to really look at it, that specific question, like is this particular operation going to cause an impact or not? And by my term, we've seen the model vary kind of across the board in response to criticisms of not just the modeling, but of the overall understanding that's represented by the modeling. So I think that the modeling that CalAm has done to date demonstrates a bias, which would be to be expected because they're the applicant in this case.
So if it shouldn't be looking at just the specific effect, what should the models be looking at?
The idea is to simulate the aquifer system, the groundwater system in which the project or projects are going to be operating, and then simulate that groundwater system to the best possible degree, measured against objective criteria. Thus, we talk about that in different ways, calibration, and in this case, the number 12 describes validation, which is a higher level of critique or evaluation. But the idea there is to understand the flow system and then be able to evaluate how particular actions, in this case, the slant well operation, or a particular design of the slant well operation or of the project would or wouldn't have an impact on the groundwater flow system. And then how those impacts to the groundwater flow system translate to potential harms or risks to the other stakeholders that are in the basin.
Have any of the models that you've reviewed to date related to this project been validated?
No.
Is the modeling performed to date for this project consistent with the effort that you've experienced in your career?
Objection beyond the scope. We're talking about special condition 12. We did not talk about all the modeling to date, which, by the way, goes back to modeling done before the State Water Board, the PUC, the Coastal Commission. I did not get into all that modeling, so way beyond the scope.
This is one where I'm going to exercise hearing officer discretion and say I'd like to hear the answer. So I'm going to say, go ahead, Dr. Kincaid, if you can respond to that question.
No, I don't believe that the modeling that's been done to date, including our modeling, rises to the level that would be consistent with an aquifer characterization or an aquifer protection effort. It's certainly not consistent with other efforts that I've participated in the past, even efforts that were done by other private entities. So no, I don't believe that this modeling effort is a targeted modeling, has always been a targeted modeling effort designed specifically to look at the operation of the test slant well and what might happen as a consequence of that operation.
In your career, based on your experience in your career, what should have been done or what should be done?
As a respectful, same objection. I mean, this not only goes beyond the scope, but perhaps an entirely new area of testimony. What should have been done? I mean, that's over the last 15 years when this has been analyzed. And naturally, we would have serious responses from our experts. But that, I understand the last one.
Right. No, I understand,
This
Mr.
is
Benson.
way going beyond.
We can leave it as a standing objection, but maybe Mr. Burchard, I wonder here if you can ask it more specifically. Maybe it's just a refresher on the question with respect to, in terms of what should have been done. Can you be more specific about what the parameters of that are in the question?
In your experience, you said aquifer protection efforts. In your experience, what kind of modeling efforts are usually performed for those efforts?
Well, mostly it involves a more rigorous calibration effort. So calibration, like I explained before, is the effort to match model simulated conditions to measured conditions. Now, the most common one that everybody focuses on, of course, is heads, but that by no means is limited to heads. In my experience, particularly when it goes to aquifer protection, you look for other forms of hydraulic conditions to calibrate too, such as flows. That was the discussion about our effort to try to calibrate the model to an estimate of ocean inflow. But if you have, the idea would be to calibrate to estimates for river gains and losses, which hasn't been done. Those were accounted for in the translation of information from the regional model, but by no means were the models calibrated to reasonable estimates or measurements of those. Other forms might be cross-boundary flows, but then since we're dealing with transport, that remains a major open avenue as well. There's really no constraint on no calibration, no rigorous test of the model simulated conditions against something that's been measured in the real world. So that could include things like the persistence or the movement of the seawater intrusion front over time, or it could mean something entirely different, such as an attempt to calibrate to movement of well-documented contaminant plumes in the area. So would be another way to try to calibrate the parameters specific to transport. So that would be, and the idea then ultimately would be to develop a probabilistic understanding of potential impact as opposed to a deterministic understanding of impact. In other words, instead of a singular line on a map, you'd be generating a probabilistic distribution. So you'd say, we think that the impact is going to occur somewhere within this zone.
You had said that you wouldn't trust CalAm to be in charge of the modeling efforts. Do you also believe that Marina Coast would have a vested interest in the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, all parties ultimately have a particular vested interest in their respective, things that they're most concerned about, which is why all the stakeholders would have a seat at that table to be present and participate in the definition of the very critical parameters, which is what constitute validation and what constitutes an impact or a change that is actionable. So that would be that's why all the parties would need to be present.
Has anyone ever told you that if after your investigation in these efforts that we're here for, that you were confident that the project would not cause harm to anyone, that would be a bad thing?
No, I was hired to evaluate the groundwater flow system and to develop the best understanding of groundwater flow system that I could, and then to determine what the range of potential impacts might be from the project. And it was made very clear that they wanted to know an honest answer, which is exactly the kind of project that I look for. So in this case, if we determined that there was no impact, then there would be no impact and no cause for concern. But that's not what we determined.
I'm going to move on a little. Mr. Betts had asked you about CCB files and HDS files. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And why were the CCB and the HDS files delivered for phase 3 different than the files for phase 2?
So once we got the rebuttal testimony and saw Dr. Ye's criticism that the particle tracks that we delivered were from a different model, we investigated that, and we determined that we had inadvertently run those particle tracks with one of the many versions of the model that we had developed to test the impact of the distribution of slant well pumping across the DSA and the upper 180-foot aquifer, which are unknowns. We don't know exactly how that pumping is going to be distributed. So one of the things that I directed my team to do was to evaluate different potential realizations of what that distribution would look like. Now, the standard method for the accepted sort of practice for doing that would be to define that on the basis of transmissivity. And so two of the distributions that we evaluated stemmed from slightly different ways of estimating what that percentage would look like on the basis of the transmissivity assigned in the model. So transmissivity is a function of hydraulic conductivity and thickness. So depending on exactly where and how you average the thickness over the cells that were constitute the test slant well, you come out with a little bit different numbers. So one of those versions was a distribution that is 19% to the DSA and 81% to the upper, the 180-foot aquifer. And the other distribution was 21% to the DSA and 79% to the 180-foot aquifer. So a 2% difference in the distribution between the two aquifers that are not separated by an aquitard. So we looked at those, and there was really no difference between them. The intent ultimately was to go with 1981, which is what we went with for the delivery of the scenario models. And as a sort of a consequence of the environment that we're in, we don't delete anything. And so those 2179 models were still present. And unfortunately, the 2179 models were used to develop those particle tracks that were submitted with my testimony. After the difference was called out and we went back and looked at it and realized that we had done that, I directed my team to run the particle tracks for the 1981 version and confirmed what I knew would be the case, which is that there's really no perceptible difference between the groundwater flow patterns. Those particle tracks were used for a qualitative presentation of groundwater flow pattern. We didn't perform any quantitative analyses with them. So qualitatively, in other words, to the eye, there's really no difference. And if you look, there is a slight difference in a couple of the particle tracks in the capture zone, but nonetheless, we ran all of those and prepared comparative sets so that we could demonstrate that there is no meaningful difference, certainly no difference in the presentation of groundwater flow patterns.
So does the difference in those files, does that affect the usefulness of the particle tracks provided in your testimony?
No, the reality is that we don't know exactly how it's going to go down anyway. And if anything, looking at the variation, provides a bit of sensitivity to see, how sensitive the simulated groundwater flow patterns are to the potential variation that will occur in reality if the slant wells are developed in terms of how much water comes from which aquifer.
Outside of, well, have you had a lot of communication or emails back? Have you shared emails back and forth with CalAM's experts?
No, not since our, not to a meaningful extent, since our the last time that we worked together with the experts meeting.
During this entire process, have you guys emailed each other and asked for files or documents?
during the entire process.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And if anybody from CalAM's team had emailed you and asked you for different files, would you have provided them?
We certainly would have tried to, provide those. Yeah.
Why did you use the 1981 distribution for the flow model as opposed to the 2179?
Really, it was a consensus. They just came down to the idea that was a slightly more reliable estimation on the basis of transmissivity. So we went with the 1981.
Mr. Betts also asked you some questions about the return water agreement. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, and I believe you said that the return water agreement could help mitigate some alleged harm.
Yes.
What harm would be mitigated?
Primarily drawdown would be mitigated, and then that could extend to the other predicted impacts as well, because they stem from drawdown.
Would it, when you say mitigated, does that mean it would eliminate the harm?
No.
So when you say mitigate, you mean reduce?
Yes.
Would the return water, any of the scenarios you've seen, would that eliminate harm in the Monterey subbasin caused by the project?
No.
Would it mitigate harm in the Monterey subbasin?
It could. It depends. Mostly, I think it depends on what happens to the balance of the return water that comes out of the agreement. So a portion of it would be delivered to Castroville, and the portion of it would go, as I've been told, it would go to the CSIP program, and where and how that gets distributed would have a very significant effect on where the drawdown created by the project is mitigated.
Would there still be drawdown in the Monterey subbasin?
Yes.
Okay. Would there still be an effect on cross-boundary flows caused by the project?
Yes, I believe so.
Mr. Betts also asked you some questions about the flow model and specifically the decision to use the June 12 model instead of the June 1 model. Do you remember that?
Yes.
In your words, why was it the decision made to use the June 12th model?
It was better. It was better calibrated.
Mr. Betts also, he asked you some questions about the distance of the southern boundary model between CalAM's prior model and the party's current water board steady state models. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Okay, and in the prior models, and I guess now I'll specifically talk about CalAM's 2022 transient model. The southern boundary of the model was about a mile from Marina Coast Wells. Is that right?
That sounds about right. Yes.
And that was a concern for you at that time?
Yes, because the southern boundary is an arbitrary boundary. It's not it doesn't correspond to real world divide or boundary in the groundwater flow system. So it has to be specified, and how you specify it, therefore, has a very direct impact on what the model simulates will or will not happen in the vicinity, certainly in the vicinity of that boundary. And it's generally good practice to push the boundary as far away as possible from the things that you're trying to simulate. So once the purpose of the modeling expanded to include how the MCWD wells would be affected, the relative distance or the distance between the MCWD wells and that southern boundary became more of a critical issue.
I believe you also said that in Marina Coast Water Board Steady State Model 2023, there is a constant head boundary in the ocean. Is that correct?
Yes, in both models there's a constant head boundary in the ocean. So, but yes.
And I believe Mr. Betts' point was that in your model, the constant head boundary in the DSA is at the beach. Is that right?
Yes, in both models, the constant head boundary is assigned, it extends to the beach.
Okay. So again, the southern boundary model was the southern boundary was a concern in the prior models because it was within a mile from the Marina Coast Wells, but the constant head boundary is right at the beach. Why do you not have the same concern?
I don't have the same concern because it really is a constant head boundary. It's the ocean. So how now exactly how you represent that, it, you know, creates pros and cons for different things. And as I explained, the pro that I was looking for and by choosing the method that I did was the ability to run many simulations to develop a better understanding of the groundwater flow system during our limited time we had for calibration. So, but there really is an ocean, and it really is right next to those wells. So, assigning it that way doesn't rise to the same level of concern as assigning an arbitrary boundary close to something that you're really trying to understand.
There was talk about recharge as well, and Mr. Betts, I think, made the point that the average recharge in the EKA soil moisture balance model was, I think, 4.93 inches.
It was 4.93 inches for the sand, let's call it the pile of sand component of the dune sand aquifer footprint.
And in your model, you used a higher recharge value. So why did you not use the average recharge from the EKI model?
As I explained, I believe that, well, recharge is not a measurable quantity. So there are many ways to estimate it, and EKI used a fairly rigorous method to estimate it, but that method is still subject to considerable uncertainty. In this particular case, well, in all cases, recharge is calculated from the hydrologic flow equation, or the hydrologic equation, which is that precipitation is equal to the sum of evapotranspiration, runoff, and recharge. And we can assume there's not really any runoff in the pile of sand, so recharge becomes precipitation minus evapotranspiration. But you can't measure evapotranspiration. You can estimate it. So that means that your estimate for recharge is necessarily uncertain. So I said that I intended to use recharge, particularly in this dune sand, or the big pile of sand component of the dune sand aquifer, as a variable in the calibration effort, specifically to account for that uncertainty. And because the amount of recharge moving from the dune sand aquifer into the upper 180 is definitely a very important process that we need to understand. And so it doesn't make any sense to me to fix that from an estimate and then just simply live with the error that it propagates down to in terms of underprediction of heads. So despite the fact that we used it for calibration, we're still underpredicting heads in the dune sand aquifer, the coastal part of the dune sand aquifer, and the upper 180-foot aquifer, which implies to me that despite the fact that we used the high end of the range that was calculated in EKI's modeling, we're probably still underestimating the amount of recharge that's actually getting in to the dune sand aquifer, into at least the big pile of sand component of the dune sand aquifer.
Yeah. And then you heard Mr. Moore was questioning Ms. Nelson about the transport model.
Yes.
Okay. Does the transport model calibrate to water levels?
No, transport models don't calibrate to water levels. No.
Okay. I don't have any more questions at this time, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Burchard. Thank you, Dr. Kincaid, for joining us once again today. I think with that, we can turn to our last, well, I should ask you, Mr. Burchard, do you have questions for Ms. Nelson?
I do not.
Okay, then that resolves it. I think the next move would be to probably take a brief break, unless I turn to the CalAm team, unless you can tell me you don't have any further questions. I assume you will need a brief break to organize your thoughts. So maybe I'll look to you, Mr. Osias. Do you anticipate you'll at least have some questions for some of the witnesses?
I subject to a brief conference. I think I have a few questions for Mr. Tietze.
Okay. Let's go ahead and just take a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene. So it's 2:25. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 2:35 and see if we need to pick up on recross and with which witnesses. See you in 10. Welcome back. I apologize. I'm a few minutes late here. I will turn to you, Mr. Osias, or Mr. Moore. I see you're both off mute. What is your plan for any recross that you may have?
I believe I have a few minutes with Mr. Titsa, and I believe Mr. Betts has a few minutes with Dr. Kincaid.
Great. And do you have a preference? Are you proposing to go in that order?
Yes.
Wonderful. So if we will then start with any recross you may have of Mr. Titsa, and I'll ask my team to, there we have Mr. Titsa here. And I think with that, I will turn things over to you, Mr. Osias, to go ahead with your questions.
Thank you. And why don't we go ahead and put up Exhibit 22 again, since there was a long answer regarding that exhibit. And page 1 is fine. Now I have to find Mr. Titsa. There you are.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Titsa.
Good afternoon.
So in your written testimony, which is exhibit Marina 62, you referenced on the reference page this exhibit with the phrase prepared for Marina Coast Water District. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and that's true, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Who gave you that understanding?
Honestly, I don't recall. That's the way that we referenced it in the GSP. So we researched our references at that time, and I'm assuming we learned that it was prepared for Marina Coast Water District.
Okay, and just to make sure I don't cause any confusion between the last time I questioned you and today, is the we the same team you identified before?
So we, in this case, would be the team that that pulled together the groundwater sustainability plan, which includes some of the same people plus additional people that were engaged in that particular exercise.
It is not a peer-reviewed published article, correct?
That's correct. Yes. It's a consulting report in essence.
At the time of this report, actually, do you know Mr. Gottschalk?
No, I don't.
So do you know if he was a graduate student at the time of this report?
I believe so, but I do not know for certain.
Okay. If he was a graduate student, would it have been in the PhD program at Stanford?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know Dr. Knight?
Yes, I do. Not well, but I do know her.
Okay. Let me back up 1 minute. Is Mr. Gottschalk or Dr. Gottschalk, I don't know which it is he alive? Do you know?
To be honest, I don't know of his whereabouts since 2020 when he published the findings or some of the findings of this report in a journal, and that's the last that I've tracked him.
And he's at least as a shorthand, he's an AEM expert,
Yes, I believe so.
not a hydrogeologist, correct?
I can't really vouch for his specific qualifications and areas of expertise, short of that he worked with Dr. Knight and under Dr. Knight in the geophysics program at Stanford.
And AEM stands for what?
Airborne electromagnetics?
Thank you. And that's sort of part of a geophysics focus, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And Dr. Knight is still alive?
Yes.
And do you know Ted Ash?
No, I don't.
I think it's Dr. Ash, actually. You don't know him?
No.
And do you know any of the other authors?
No, I don't.
Mr. Gottschalk and Dr. Knight were not witnesses in this proceeding, correct?
I have no knowledge of that.
You don't know one way or the other.
I don't know one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. And I didn't remind you, but that's a perfect example of a great answer when you don't know something rather than saying yes or no, say you don't know. So you remember that. Okay, Dr. Ash was a witness in this proceeding, correct?
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay, so I assume that means you don't know, you never read Dr. Ash's report for this proceeding.
Can you clarify what you mean by Dr. Ash's report for this proceeding?
I mean, his direct testimony and the technical memorandum he submitted in support of it.
So I'm familiar with a report dated 2019 that repeated some of this work reported in this 2018 report. I've not read any other works by any of the other by Dr. Ash or Jared Abraham.
So to the extent Dr. Ash submitted testimony in writing, as almost all the witnesses were required to do here, you haven't read it.
No, I have not.
Okay. Nor do I take it, did you read a transcript of his direct or cross-examination, correct?
No, I did not.
You didn't review any summary slides that he prepared, correct?
I did not.
And you didn't review either the transcript of his cross-exam? I'm sorry if I just asked you that.
I have not.
Okay. Nor did you watch or listen to those proceedings, correct?
I have not.
And you have no knowledge about the sequence of authors on this study, do you? When I say sequence, I mean what order they were listed on this page.
Okay. Can you explain what you mean by sequence? Do you mean their primacy in terms of responsibility?
No, I just mean the sequence that they're listed. They're not alphabetic, for example, correct?
Yeah, I have no knowledge of that. I didn't even notice that, to be honest.
And you also have no knowledge of Dr. Ash's explanation for the sequence that appeared on many reports and publications involving the same people and him, correct?
No, I've never heard anything about that.
Okay. And if there was any criticism of Dr. Ash's work, either in conjunction with these people or otherwise, you're unaware of that if the criticism was from this proceeding, correct?
I'm aware of criticism by the Hydrologic Working Group of AquaGeo Framework's 2019 report. And, I've read that criticism. I do not know if that criticism is in evidence in this proceeding or not.
Okay, but how about any criticism from 2021 or 2022 in this proceeding?
No, none.
No knowledge. I talked over you, I apologize. My question was, you have no knowledge, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Mr. Spalding asked you a question about this exhibit and your reliance on it and whether that was appropriate. Do you remember his question?
I do.
And your answer with respect to whether it was appropriate to rely on it was yes. And then he asked you the question, why? Do you remember that question?
I do.
And then you gave a fairly long answer, which included a phrase, it was well researched. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And you reached that conclusion because you looked at their original research?
I reached that conclusion by looking at their report and by reviewing their data and comparison between the AEM findings and the lithologic logs in the area and other lithologic data and cross sections in the area, as well as water quality data.
Did you rehearse that answer that you gave to why with Mr. Spalding or anyone else from his office?
Did I rehearse it? I would say I thought about it. I knew that a question of this type might come up because this is an important piece of work in consideration of this proceeding. So in that sense, I definitely thought about how I would answer why I relied on it and what its significance is. Yes.
Do you know if any of the authors are have specialties in hydrogeology?
I'm sorry.
Mr. Tietze may have frozen. Oh, no, it looks like we're back. You may have to ask.
Okay. I think I'm back. Can you
Remember my
repeat
question?
the question, please, Mr. Espai?
Yes, and let's do one practice question because I heard a bit of an echo. So how are you feeling this afternoon?
I'm feeling well, thank you.
Okay, so that sounded clear. Great. So my question was, do you know which of the authors, if any, are hydrogeologists?
No, I do not. Not off the top of my head.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Tietze.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osias, and thank you once again, Mr. Tietze, for joining us. And I think next I'm going to be turning to Mr. Betts and Dr. Kincaid, if I understand correctly.
Yes, please.
Please, and I will look to my team to pin the appropriate screens.
Thank you. May I proceed?
Yes, there's Dr. Kincaid. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Betts.
Thank you very much. On redirect, some questions were asked of you about the executive director of the Coastal Commission, which I appreciate, and I think this is important. Do you know who the executive director is?
No.
Do you know his or her background at all?
No.
Knowledge of water law or the issues presented to him or her?
No.
Do you have any reason to believe that the executive director will be biased towards one party or another in serving in the role as described in Special Condition 12?
I have reason to believe that everybody has vested interests. And so everybody that has a different vested interest should have a seat at the table.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry. That wasn't my,
So no, I have no knowledge that anybody would have a particular bias other than that general premise, which I think is pretty well accepted.
well, I'm not sure if I follow. I'm just asking again about the executive director. Do you have any knowledge from any source whatsoever that this executive director will be biased towards any party in serving in the role described in Special Condition 12?
No.
Do you have any reason to believe that the Coastal Commission isn't capable of supervising Special Condition 12?
Yes. As I said, I believe that it's imperative that all stakeholders have representation in that kind of an effort. So, and I know nothing about the Coastal Commission personally, but it has been my experience that whenever particular stakeholders don't have a representation at the table, they feel disenfranchised. And so the best way to achieve a product in which everybody agrees to is for everybody to have representation at the table. And that's been my direct experience with projects just like that. I've actually been hired to represent people in those exact types of endeavors.
But to be clear, you have no information whatsoever to suggest that the executive director will be biased towards any party in serving in the role in special condition 12, correct?
Correct.
And are you aware that after a draft report came out, which delineated special condition 12, Marina Coast Water District had the opportunity to comment on special condition 12?
I'm not aware of, as I told you, I'm actually, first time I observed that document is when you asked me to read it.
Would it surprise you that Marina Coast Water District raised none of the issues that you delineated today when discussing special condition 12?
Yeah, I guess it would surprise me.
Okay, and we will get that document in or propose it. Do you know what testimony Marina Coast Water District presented to the Coastal Commission that ultimately led to its decision?
No.
Can you testify under penalty of perjury that you're certain special condition 12 won't mitigate against any potential harm caused by the project?
Objection. It's vague. It calls for speculation, and we're now way outside the contents of the redirect.
I think the objection is, I'm going to sustain the objection, at least with respect to vagueness. If you would like to be more specific, Mr. Betts.
Sure.
Try again.
Sure. Can you testify under penalty of perjury that you're certain that special condition 12 won't mitigate against any of the hypothetical harm you presented in this phase 3?
I can testify under penalty of perjury that it is my opinion that the special condition 12 is insufficient to ensure that Marina Coast Water District interests are adequately addressed.
And what about, like you talked initially, or I believe in redirect, about the concept that the parties should agree on modeling parameters. Is that correct?
I said that we agreed to try to reach agreement on as many conditions or many parameters that were incorporated into the model as possible.
But sir, when you agreed upon certain parameters, for example, using 11 model layers, you unilaterally chose not to use perhaps one of the most important model layers, model layer 1, correct?
Number one, no, I chose to deviate from that.
Okay.
And I did not, however, that's a compound question. So I did not deviate from what Mr. Lilly directed us to do, which was to reach, that is exactly your question. You asked me if I deviated from what I agreed to do, and I did not. I agreed to build the best model I could build while while agreeing on as many parameters as I could. And we did that. And that's exactly what we did. And then the layer 1 is not the most important component of the model. It is a component of the model, but it is not the most important component of the model. And the way we represented, as I explained, the way we represented the hydraulic continuity between the ocean and the submarine portions of the aquifers is quite defensible.
Would you like to see the status report from March 12 when it says the parties agree to accommodate 11 model layers, which included model layer 1, the seabed?
No, I would not like to see it. I already saw it.
You agreed to it, correct?
We submitted that, but prior to that and after that, I raised concerns during our discussions with Mr. Lilly, and you can check the record. I guarantee you, he said, I do not, nearly a quote, I do not want you to sacrifice what you believe to be the best possible model you can generate. And I think he said that explicitly then, because he didn't want to end up in a situation where we could say that we didn't do the best we could in exchange for meeting some kind of arbitrary assignment. So after we reached agreement on the 11 layers, the conditions changed, fundamentally changed, because we also agreed to calibrate to equivalent freshwater heads, but yet we couldn't achieve that.
Yeah,
Dr. Kincaid and Mr. Betts. Mr. Betts, I think you've made your point. If you want one follow-up question on this, but we've been through this before, and we understand.
Okay, I just respectfully moved to strike. He won't answer my questions, but he answers Mr. Brochard's. I mean, I asked a simple question: did you agree to it? And I can't get an answer to even that. So
I already told you that I didn't agree to that.
Dr.
Or that I
Kincaid,
agreed to
It's enough.
that. I'm sorry.
it's
Yes,
enough. Thank
I
you.
understand.
The issue about the different files, the changing files. Make sure I get my language correct. How you change the .cbb and .hds files from phase 2 to phase 3. You gave an explanation to Mr. Brochard. That's the first time you've ever given anyone an explanation of why you changed those two files. Isn't that correct?
Objection, it assumes facts, not in evidence. It assumes that the files were changed as opposed to the files were derived from something else. I think Dr. Kincaid could probably answer what he's getting at, but
All right, I'll give Dr. Kincaid some room to answer the question, although Mr. Betts, I understand your frustration with getting a direct answer, so
Yeah.
we can follow up with that, but Dr. Kincaid, go ahead.
Can I just say my very simple question is not why, because I think we got issues that, but is today the first time you've explained why these files are different? Not week's explanation. Is today the first time you've told anyone from our side, CalAmp side, the experts, or the administrative hearing officer?
Yes.
Now, there were some questions asked about additional modeling you would want to do. Do you recall those questions from Mr. Brochard?
Yes.
Have you done any of that additional modeling?
No.
Sir, isn't it correct? There's no amount of modeling that anyone could ever do on this planet that will satisfy Marina Coast Water District, because the models that have done to date consistently yield different results, or positive results for CalAm and results that are adverse to Marina Coast.
No, that I don't believe that's true at all. I believe that fundamentally what's at issue is a trust issue.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Betts, and thank you, Dr. Kincaid, for joining us once again. I will ask my team to unpin us so I can better see the room. Wonderful, thank you. I think at this point we have completed the phase 3 summaries of direct testimony, cross-examination, and redirect and then re-cross-examination of all the witnesses. Is that, if I'm incorrect, please someone speak up. All right, so I wanted to take a moment and just thank all of our witnesses who joined us, really for the entire proceeding, but in particular for phase 3 while I've been here. I really appreciate your testimony and your patience. This is a long process, and I also recognize that your testimony here is the culmination of a great amount. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the amount of work that went into preparing this testimony and the reports that support them and all of this. So I really appreciate your work as we try to get to the bottom of these very complicated issues. So thank you. It is now, let's see, look, it's 3 o'clock. I want to look around the room to see if we have other procedural issues to address before we break for the day. But let me just reiterate what I'm inclined to address all of the procedural issues having to do with the admission of evidence when we reconvene on the 12th, just because I think it'll be more efficient. It'll give me a chance to get my thoughts in order. I know we have an outstanding offer of evidence from CalAm, which I accepted most of it into evidence except for some particular slides. I know I have to rule on that issue. We have outstanding objections from CalAm to some of Marina Coast and City of Marina's exhibits and testimony. But I think it makes sense for us to address everything on the 12th so that we can do this in an orderly way and we have a chance to get all of our thoughts in order. But are there other issues, procedural issues that we should address today, given that we have a little bit of time? Mr. Wilkins, I see you.
I just want to confirm that the AHO doesn't have any questions for our experts and that they're done. I guess, and won't need to come back.
I'll come back. That is my intent. Let me just confirm with my team, Mr. Wooldridge or Ms. Graziano, do you have any questions for the witnesses while we have them here?
I do not.
Thank you. I know we had, what I'd like to do is, I don't think we'll have additional questions. I would like to sort of, within my, just reserve the right to ask on a different day. to come back, but that would be, I realize we haven't talked about that. We haven't coordinated that. So if we did do that, we'd probably want to meet or at least communicate about that if we have additional questions that come up as we're working through some of these issues and really digesting them. But at least for today and for the 12th, that is Mr. Wilkins, you've moved on my screen, which is not your fault. There you are. That is the correct understanding, that we can thank the witnesses for their time and move away from that. Does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And I see both Mr. Osias and Ms. Meisenheimer. I'm not sure who was first, but Mr. Osias, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I had mentioned this morning, right before the lunch break, and I want to mention it again.
Yes.
Exhibit clarification, which is not offering anything new, but sort of clarifying the record that was today while it's fresh in your mind. It'll take me, I don't know, 7 minutes and looking at 3 different documents, but each one is already either been admitted or not admitted. And there won't be any request to change that status today, but I thought it important for you to know about it. Is that okay to do?
Let's do that. Let me get to Ms. Meisenheimer just to see where we're at. But yes, let's please do that today. I think that is a good use of our time. So thank you.
And then my last comment was going to be the same question that Mr. Wilkins asked, which I understand the answer. But I will also comment that there have been a lot of postponed vacations in light of new hearings and hearing dates. And so we certainly would not want to miss the opportunity to have anyone answer any questions that you or your staff have, but as much warning as to when that might take place would be greatly appreciated. So even if someone's gone, maybe they can find their way to a terminal or something.
Absolutely. And hopefully not. I know many of the witnesses and attorneys in this proceeding have really, you've done a lot and you've appeared from different corners of the earth. So I appreciate that, Mr. Osias. I will do my best to give as much advance notice as possible and coordinate with schedules as much as possible.
Thank you.
Ms. Meisenheimer, I think you're next up, please.
Thank you. We wanted to alert the AHO and CalAm that we may file a motion to strike a few questions and answers that were predicated on the premise that Marina Exhibit 22 had not been admitted. We need to look at the transcript before we make that decision, and I understand that should be out shortly. If we do so, we would propose filing it on the same schedule where we would file October 3rd, and then CalAm could file an opposition October 10th.
Yes, please. That makes sense to me, and I appreciate having a consolidated schedule. So yes, thank you. Before we turn back to Mr. Osias and we all discuss some clarification on the exhibits, is there anything else we should talk about? All right, with that, I turn to you, Mr. Osias, to take it away, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. And there are multiple experts on this site on the topic I'm about to just illustrate. But if we could go to CalAm Exhibit 68, page 1, just so everyone can see what it is. This is, as it says in the upper left, decision issued September 13, 2018. If we could then go to the bottom half of page 77. And I believe it's now on the 74. Could we go to 77? Sorry. Page 77.
Maybe actual page 77 and not, yeah.
Yeah, by the time this hearing's over, I will have that figured out. But that doesn't seem right either. So I think maybe it's back on page PDF page 78. Well, there it is. Well, sorry. I guess we should start so you can see the beginning of the top paragraph. So it's in the last two lines of 77. Okay, so this is the mitigation monitoring and reporting program attached as Appendix D to this decision. Okay, and then if we go to the next page. And you'll see a single line paragraph that starts with therefore. It says, therefore, we will adopt the MMRP as set out in Appendix D. Okay. So if we then go to CalAm Exhibit 131. By the way, I'm sorry, 68 has been admitted into evidence. And this is the decision that Mr. Betts said only attached physically Appendix A and therefore did not attach Appendix D. And Exhibit 131 is in fact Appendix D. If you scroll down to see the page numbers, it starts with page D1. It's got the August 2018 date. Ms. Stoner, Musine, and I had email correspondence about this very exhibit. She sent me an email saying there was no objection to its admission, and it was admitted. If we could go to page 13 of this exhibit. I believe that's PDF page 13. And then we have to rotate it. And we're going to need 14 too. So if you could rotate, there you go. Yep. Perfect. And if you could even make this bigger, we don't need to see the columns on the right. This section 4.4, which is on this page and on the next PDF page. If we could just show the next page. Is also found in Exhibit 98, which is what Mr. Betts mistakenly showed the witness. And I will tell you during the lunch hour, I did this check, and I encourage everyone else to do this check. But the two sections that Mr. Betts showed the witness from Exhibit 98 are word for word identical to what's found here in Exhibit 131. The two exhibits are not identical. But these two sections, which Mr. Betts was using for his cross-examination of Dr. Kincaid, and which, you know, I remember something about boilerplate. Those two sections from those two exhibits are exactly the same. And so rather than have a fight about Exhibit 98, if we could deem the question said Exhibit 131 and the answer was about 131, after everyone confirms they're word for word identical, I think we save ourselves a great deal of trouble.
And then at the risk of going down this rabbit hole, which we're trying to avoid, maybe, will you clarify for me, Mr. Osais, what Exhibit 98 was? As I understand it, it was a modified version.
So
later, I should say later dated version.
Yes, and this may be subject to something we argue about on the admission argument day. But the decision, I mean, you know, you know this probably better than me, but you have a public agency making a decision, they have to comply with CEQA. And as part of their decision about a project, they also have to make a decision about CEQA and CEQA findings. And so, as you just saw, the decision attaches as part of its EIR and EIS approval, the mitigation and monitoring reporting program, which was submitted as part of the EIR EIS, drafted by the environmental consultant for the PUC, and that's what's attached to their decision. Subsequent to that, Exhibit 98, which has a September 2019 date, is a very similar but not identical mitigation, monitoring, and compliance program. So it's CalAM's proposal is how to comply with the obligation to monitor and mitigate. And that has not been acted on yet by the PUC. And they aren't required to act on it till the project gets closer, but it is CalAM's proposal, but drafted by still the independent consultant, I believe, ESA, for a compliance program as compared to what came out of the EIR-ES. So that's my hopefully short, incomplete explanation. And if we think it's a document worthy of admission, I don't know whether there'll be opposition. We won't be fighting about whether it was part of the order or decision, but that's for another day.
Thank you, Mr. Osias. I think that was very helpful and hopefully will help us cut through some of our discussion when we meet again on the 12th. Does anyone else have anything? And Ms. Mullen, I think we can take this down. Thank you. Are there any other comments on this issue with respect to Exhibit 68, 131, and Appendix D, or Exhibit 98? And with that, I'll take one last look. Is there anything else we should address today before we break and reconvene on October 12th at 9 a.m.? Well, thank you. Thank you for being efficient. We got through it. I really appreciate it. And I will see all of you on October 12th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.